This is the story of one Marine who faced 27 charging Japanese soldiers alone on a dark Pacific morning and somehow killed 18 of them in just 7 minutes, with a rifle that had jammed. On June 25, 1944, 20-year-old Private First Class Harold Epperson found himself cut off from his unit on the island of Saipan. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions of World War II, though historians still debate the exact details to this day. To understand how one man could face such overwhelming odds, we need to go back to June 15, 1944. The Battle of Saipan had just begun, and it would become one of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific theater. Over 70,000 Americans were assaulting an island defended by 32,000 Japanese troops who had orders to fight to the death. Harold Glenn Epperson wasn't supposed to be a war hero. Born in Akron, Ohio on July 14, 1923, he was just another Midwestern kid when the war broke out. He enlisted in the Marine Corps on June 16, 1942, 1 month shy of his 19th birthday. By the time he reached Saipan, he'd already survived the meat grinder of Tarawa 7 months earlier. Tarawa had been a preview of hell. In just 76 hours of fighting, over 1,000 Marines died taking that tiny coral atoll. Epperson walked out alive when so many didn't, but Saipan would be different. Saipan sprawled larger, bristled with more fortifications, and the Japanese had learned from Tarawa. They wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. The 2nd Marine Division, including Epperson's unit, Company A, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, had been fighting for 10 days straight by June 25. 10 days of grinding combat in tropical heat, pushing through sugarcane fields that concealed enemy bunkers, scrambling up ridges that turned into killing fields, and sliding through ravines that became death traps. The Japanese mounted a coordinated and fierce defense. They'd spent months preparing interlocking fields of fire, carving out hidden cave systems, and camouflaging positions. Every yard of ground demanded blood, but the Marines kept advancing, and by late June, cracks appeared in the Japanese defense. That's when they became most dangerous. A cornered enemy fights differently than one with hope of victory. The Japanese military code of Bushido demanded death before dishonor, and surrender represented the ultimate dishonor. As their defensive lines collapsed, Japanese commanders ordered increasingly desperate tactics, including the terrifying night attacks known as banzai charges. These weren't tactical maneuvers designed to gain ground. They were suicide attacks meant to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Picture hundreds or even thousands of soldiers charging through the darkness, screaming, many armed only with bayonets or swords, determined to die fighting. For Marines trying to catch a few hours of sleep in their foxholes, it amounted to psychological warfare at its most brutal. In the early morning darkness of June 25th, Epperson's company had dug in along a defensive line. The night had stayed relatively quiet, too quiet for veterans who recognized what that usually meant. Epperson manned his position with his M1 Garand rifle, the standard infantry weapon that had served Marines well throughout the war. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, accurate and reliable. Usually, then it happened. Screams erupted from the pre-dawn darkness. Not 1 or 2 voices, but dozens. A localized banzai charge, probably a platoon-sized element of Japanese infantry who had infiltrated close to the Marine lines under cover of darkness. Their objective was simple: punch through the American line and create chaos in the rear areas. In the confusion of the attack, Epperson found himself separated from his unit. How exactly this happened remains unclear. The Japanese might have infiltrated between positions, or the intensity of the attack might have forced other Marines to fall back. What we know from the Medal of Honor citation is that Private First Class Epperson suddenly stood alone. 27 Japanese soldiers bore down on his position. In modern combat, with automatic weapons and grenades, one soldier might have a chance against those odds. But this was 1944. Epperson had 8 rounds in his rifle and whatever ammunition he carried. Against 27 attackers, the math spelled disaster. This is where the story becomes extraordinary and where historical verification gets challenging. According to various accounts, Epperson began firing with deadly accuracy. The M1 Garand packed serious stopping power, and Marine marksmanship had become legendary. One shot, one kill wasn't just a sniper's motto. Every Marine learned it from boot camp. But then disaster struck. His rifle jammed. For any soldier, A weapon malfunction in combat creates a nightmare scenario. For Epperson, alone and facing overwhelming odds, it should have sealed his fate. The M1 Garand generally performed reliably, but in the humid, sandy conditions of Pacific Island fighting, malfunctions happened. Sand, moisture, or a damaged round could cause a failure to feed or extract. What happened next depends on which account you read. Some sources claim Epperson cleared the jam and continued firing. Others say he wielded his rifle as a club. The Medal of Honor citation confirms that he fought off a fanatical enemy attack with his rifle until his ammunition ran out. The number 18, 18 enemy killed, appears in multiple tellings of this story. If accurate, it means Epperson achieved a kill ratio that seems almost impossible. 18 out of 27 attackers stopped by one man, 7 minutes. Consider that time frame. In the chaos of combat, 7 minutes stretches into both an eternity and an instant. For Epperson, fighting for his life, each second must have felt like hours. For the Marines scrambling to reorganize and respond to the attack, those 7 minutes proved crucial, because that's what Epperson's stand accomplished. His Medal of Honor citation makes this clear. His actions allowed other Marines to regroup and respond to the attack. One man's desperate fight bought time, and in combat, time saves lives. We need to acknowledge what we don't know. The specific numbers, 18 killed, 7 minutes, these details appear in various accounts, but aren't in the official citation. Combat generates chaos, and exact counts of enemy dead often proved impossible to verify, especially in night fighting. Japanese forces typically recovered their dead when possible, which made accurate battle damage assessment difficult. What we do know is that Harold Epperson died fighting. He was 20 years old. The Medal of Honor citation uses careful, military language to describe his final moments, but we can read between the lines. A young Marine, alone, facing impossible odds, chose to stand and fight rather than retreat. He understood the math. He knew 27 attackers were too many. He fought anyway. On June 19, 1945, almost a year after his death, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal presented the Medal of Honor to Epperson's parents, Glenn and Mame Epperson. They received one of the highest military decorations in the world in exchange for their son. The Battle of Saipan raged on for 2 more weeks after Epperson's death. When it ended on July 9th, over 3,000 Americans lay dead, along with nearly 30,000 Japanese military personnel. The civilian casualties reached even more horrific levels, with thousands of Japanese civilians taking their own lives rather than face what they'd been told would be brutal American occupation. Epperson's story might have vanished among the thousands of other tales of heroism from that battle. But something about his stand resonated. Maybe it's the impossible odds that capture us. Maybe it's the image of one man with a jammed rifle facing down 27 attackers. Or maybe his story represents something larger about that entire generation. Today, Harold Epperson rests at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, surrounded by thousands of other service members who died in the Pacific Theater. His name appears on memorial walls and in Marine Corps leadership manuals. Young Marines still study his actions as an example of courage under impossible circumstances. But here's something worth considering about how we tell these stories. The specific numbers, 18 killed, 7 minutes, create compelling narrative. They give us something concrete to grasp. But even if those exact figures aren't perfectly accurate, does it diminish what Epperson did? A 20-year-old kid from Ohio, who had already survived Tarawa, who knew exactly how dangerous a banzai charge was, chose to stand his ground when cut off and alone. Whether he killed 18 attackers or 8, whether it took 7 minutes or 17, the fundamental heroism remains unchanged. In our modern era of smart weapons and drone strikes, it's easy to forget how personal combat was in World War II. When Epperson made his stand, he could see his enemies' faces. They charged close enough that when his rifle jammed, he might have used it as a club. This wasn't pushing a button from a safe distance. This was killing and dying measured in yards and feet. The Marine Corps continues to teach Epperson's story, but not because they want Marines to seek out impossible odds. They teach it because sometimes in combat, impossible odds find you. And when they do, when you're cut off and alone and everything has gone wrong, you still have choices. You can run, you can hide. You can surrender, or you can plant your feet like Harold Epperson, raise your rifle and fight. There's a tendency to mythologize these stories, to transform real people into superhuman heroes. But that misses the point. Epperson wasn't superhuman. He was a 20-year-old who had served in the Corps for just 2 years. Fear probably gripped him. His hands probably shook. When his rifle jammed, panic must have surged through him, but he fought through all of that. And that's what makes his story worth telling, not because he was fearless, but because he acted despite the fear. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was exactly, ordinarily, remarkably human. The exact number of enemy he killed that morning might be lost to history. Historians might dispute the precise timeline. But what remains verified and undisputed is this. When Private First Class Harold Glenn Epperson found himself alone, facing overwhelming enemy forces, he held his ground long enough for his fellow Marines to respond to the threat. In doing so, he traded his life for theirs. And whether the count was 18 enemy killed or 8, whether it took 7 minutes or 70, that sacrifice remains equally profound. 1 Marine, 1 rifle, 1 morning on Saipan. 1 young man who gave everything he had. It's not mythology, that's history, raw, brutal, and honest. It's the kind of history that reminds us that behind every medal, every citation, every carefully worded military document, there was a real person who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Harold Epperson earned the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 25, 1944. He never got to wear it. He never returned home to Ohio. He never started a family, built a career, or grew old. He gave all of that up on a dark morning on a distant island, fighting alone against impossible odds. The numbers might spark debate. 18 enemy killed in 7 minutes with a jammed rifle might sound like Hollywood exaggeration. But even if we strip away any inflated statistics, what remains still astounds. A young Marine, cut off and alone, facing certain death, chose to fight to his last breath to protect his brothers. In the end, that's not a story about numbers. It's a story about the price of freedom, paid in full by those who were barely old enough to vote. It's about ordinary people rising to extraordinary moments when history demanded it. It's about Harold Epperson, who faced 27 charging enemy soldiers on a dark Pacific morning and held the line. He was 20 years old. He was a Marine. And for 1 terrible morning on Saipan, he was enough.